Yeah, I think Thomas might be away from the computer. Peter, hi, welcome. John. Uh, okay. I think he's probably gonna try to refresh. Okay, Thomas, can you hear me? Testing. I had to red dot you here because I thought you were out away from the computer. You have sound? Mic check, 1, 2. Okay, anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's study, Lord willing, we're going to look at the difference between the unmarried and the married in a study that I've labeled Married Wife. Now, what I believe the Bible will be teaching here, and we've looked at a number of these verses before. We've been trying to make sense out of a series of very difficult verses when it comes to marriage in the Bible. You agree with that? And I think it's because God does not really tell us when He is shifting. We do see that God speaks of a marriage to the church, the corporate body itself, where Christ is the head of that body prior to the separation. God speaks of the marriage of the unsaved to heathen gods, going after a different gospel. And then God speaks of another marriage where the elect, once they've been separated from the corporate body, now they marry Christ. So we do have a cycle, and we have to look at the language prayerfully and also carefully when it comes to in trying to determine what it is that God might have in view. Now, what I believe here is that the picture of the elect being barren, desolate, widows, unmarried in tribulation, the time when they are put away. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32, "But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord." And we have a similar verse. Let me see if I can get that to post with all the colors here. Okay. Verse 34. "There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried," in the Bible it says the unmarried woman, but I don't think the word woman is there. It is the unmarried, that would be a better translation. "Careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit." And I do believe this is talking about the elect coming into the Great Tribulation. Now they are said to be widows, virgin, because they no longer identified or attached with the corporate body. Verse 34 did not post. Let me try it again. I don't think I got an error message. You're talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34, right? Let me try and break it up. Is that on the screen? Let me get the other part of it. There it is. "There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried careth for the things of the Lord." Now the believers, God is going to redeem them from Babylon, and now the focus is altogether on Christ when they begin to come out of the Great Tribulation. You notice it says here that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. Now take a look at these verses here in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 1. I think we begin to get a better picture. "Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing, and cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife." So we begin to suspect that, Rose, hi, welcome. Just getting started. We're looking at the difference between the married wife and the unmarried as a type of the believers coming into the Great Tribulation. So we see here more are the children of the desolate. And that's the language of salvation. In other words, when God brings the believers out of Babylon, now they are able to bring forth. They have more children than the married wife. So the married wife then, I think we begin to see, would be a picture of the unsaved church. Galatians 4:27, it is written, rejoice, thou barren that bearest not, break forth and cry, thou that travailest not, for the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Can you begin to see a picture there? Isaiah 62 verse 4. Thou shalt no more be termed forsaken, neither shall thy land be any more be termed desolate. But thou shalt be called Hephzibah, that is married, and thy land Beulah. For the Lord delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married. I think Beulah is synonymous to married. Psalm 113 verse 9, he maketh a barren woman to keep house. Is that the language of salvation? You see, when someone is barren, like Rachel or Leah back in the Old Testament, they typify, and they were not able to bear children. So they typify the church coming into the Great Tribulation. They are said to be desolate, widows, barren, not bringing forth, unmarried. But yet, because God visits them, he brings back their captivity, now they are said to bear children. So they bear more children than she which hath an husband. So he maketh a barren woman to keep house, and to be a joyful mother of children. So that, I believe, is the language of salvation. Job 24 verse 21. Context here is talking about the wicked. He evil entreateth the barren that beareth not, and doeth not good to the widow. Interesting, right? Luke 23 verse 29, for behold, the days are coming, in the which they shall say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. So again, I believe this is language of the corporate church, the body forsaking or turning away from Christ, and ultimately from the elect. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 8, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But, let me see if I can post. Can you see this verse on the screen? 1 Corinthians 7 verse 9. But if they cannot contain, did that post? I think it did, right? If they cannot contain, and the word contain there is a word that's also translated temperate. If they are not able to be temperate, there again that would seem to be speaking of the church in opposition to Christ and tribulation. Let them marry. Let them marry. And I used to think that the marriage here is the marriage between the elect and Christ as they come out of tribulation. But if you notice the language carefully in the verses that we're going to be looking at, this seems to be God admonishing them to be married, again, to stay married with the body, with the church, because coming into the Great Tribulation, as God begins to judge the body, the tendency of the church is to do what? To go after a different gospel, to fall away. So God, I believe he is encouraging and admonishing the body to be married still to Christ, not to turn away, not to separate. So if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Well, as long as the body is one prior to the separation, if they're not turning away from Christ, then they're not under the judgment of God. So it is better to marry than to burn. And we know that burn has to do with what? What do we think of when we think of burning? What comes to mind? Anyone? Mic check. Yeah, judgment. Judgment. The day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night, wherein the heaven shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. So burning, to burn, is the language of coming under the wrath of God. But I believe here in the context, which I think we're going to see, God is concerned that the body stay married to Christ and not to turn away. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And there again, the idea of touching a woman is to lust after her, to lust after a different God, a different gospel. And there is a touch that God is concerned with, that of Christ. Remember when Christ was resurrected and he showed himself to Mary, and I believe it was Mary, and she wanted to touch him, and he said, touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Remember that verse? Well, there again, touching would have to do with the believers now being reconciled to Christ. They come to be with God. And so there had to be a time, right, a precise time when the believers would come into the intimacy of marriage, right, the marriage with Christ. But in the context here, God, I believe he is speaking of the foolish woman, right? It's talking about Babylon. So it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And then we see this again here in 2 Corinthians 6 verse 17. Wherefore come out from among them, be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. Colossians 2 verse 21 and 22. Touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all perished. They are to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men. And I mentioned just now about lusting, the church lusting after another God, another gospel. Matthew 5:28. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. So there it is. Touching, lusting after, looking at another woman would be the church, the corporate body, anticipating a separation from Christ. But then we read here in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, because if you're lusting after another woman, now the church is about to put away Christ without a cause. And so she is lusting after another woman. So to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. There again, I think God is staying with the body. In other words, there is to be no separation. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 5. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate, that's what I mentioned earlier, the church coming into the Great Tribulation, said to be desolate, a widow, trusteth in God, and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. What do we think of when we think of praying to God, calling on the name of the Lord? Can you see how this would tie into the Great Tribulation? Revelation chapter 6 verse 10, they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood? So there again, I believe this is the body, the elect, now said to be widows, desolate in tribulation, but yet they trust in God, and they are waiting for the time when God would do what? Avenge their blood. Luke chapter 18 verse 7, and God shall not God avenge his own elect which cry day and night unto him. 1 Peter 3 verse 5. After this manner in the old time the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husband. So the church, the believers, they're not to separate, they're not to desire to go after another gospel. And so they trust in God, and they are in subjection to the authorities, to the body, right? The church as a whole. 1 Timothy 5 verse 14, I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give not occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. And this, I believe, again, God is looking at the believers in tribulation, or prior to coming out of Babylon. They're not to give occasion of stumbling to the enemy. In other words, they're not to go after another gospel. So they have to stay married, right? Married to whom? Well, married to Christ, even as we're looking at the body prior to the separation of wheat and tares. Now, can you see, we talked about this verse here, verse 28, 1 Corinthians 7. But if thou marry, Rose writes, so when it says a woman must keep silent in the church, yeah, that's another matter, another topic altogether. There is a study on that, Rose. We'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes. With a woman keeping silence in the church, it can be pointing to the believers being in subjection, and at the same time, today, God, I believe, has put Babylon to silence. So there's an element of salvation, I believe, that's in view, as well as judgment. We'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes. Okay, so nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. Now, we saw the last time, right, or one of the studies that we did, the context there, the fact that God speaks of those who do marry having trouble in the flesh. Well, that can't be talking about the marriage to Christ, right? Because once the believers come out of Babylon, now they are married to Christ. They're not going to find trouble. They're not going to have tribulation. So this has to be referencing, Lord willing, the marriage to Christ prior to the separation. So if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she have not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 11, but if she depart from what? From Christ, from the church, right? The falling away. If she depart, let her remain unmarried. So the believers now, they become desolate. They are no longer married to the corporate body, or be reconciled to husband. And we saw the language of reconciliation in the Bible. I believe it is always pointing to a reconciliation to Christ. So this has to be speaking of the elect. Once they separate from the church, from the body, they remain unmarried in tribulation. But then we know that when God brings back their captivity, now they are being reconciled to Christ. John writes, can barren also mean that they can't give birth in Christ until Christ give the command? Well, yeah, precisely. Amen. That's what I believe that I'm, trying to relate, Lord willing, because the fact that they can't give birth, they are barren. Who was barren in the Old Testament? Can you think of a couple of names? Or even in the New Testament? I mentioned a couple of names a little bit earlier. Sarah. Yeah, Peter. Sarah. Who else? Sarah, I believe she was Abraham's wife, right? And she couldn't bear. Rachel. And, well, at first Rachel, I think she was bearing children. But Leah. Remember, Leah was hated. And she could not bear children. You see, Leah, I believe, is a picture of the believers in tribulation. God shuts the womb. They're not bearing. They're not bringing forth. And that's what I believe we're looking at here. Those that are unmarried, they are said to be barren, desolate, because they've been cast out prior to the marriage, prior to them being reconciled to God. So yeah, so those that are barren in the Old Testament, and also I believe Elizabeth at first, she couldn't bear, right? So this again, seems to point to the church in tribulation, but then she brings forth, right? God allows them to come out. Now they are no longer barren. And God switches things around, I believe. Now the church, those who were rejoicing over the killing of the two witnesses, now they are said to be barren. Now they are said to be widows, right? Because now they've come under the wrath of God. Okay, Peter says time for bed. No problem. Thanks for coming by and sharing tonight. Good night. Okay, now let's take a look at the other side. Look at those that are actually married. And there I think God is speaking of the unsaved, those that are lusting after and engaging in marriages, right? The heathen nations, heathen gods, and tribulation. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 33. Let me see if that'll post. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world. Isn't that interesting? What does the world would usually symbolize or typify in the Bible? The world. Especially if we're looking at prior to the separation. What do we think of when we think of the world spiritually? The church, right? Love not the world, nor the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Remember that? So he that is married careth for the things that are of the world. So in other words, they're altogether concerned with the wickedness that is going on in the church. So this marriage then would have to be a marriage to other gods, right? The church going after a different gospel. Isn't that interesting? And the word woman there, I put it in brackets. The word woman is not there. I'm sorry, not the woman, but the word wife. How he may please his wife. The word, his is not there. So it's really the word wife, or more often translated woman. How he may please woman. And we see the same thing in the next verse. Verse 34. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please husband or man. Isn't that interesting? How she may please man. And in both cases, whether we're looking at male or female, I think God primarily is looking at the church. So those that are married, they are more concerned with the things of the world, the things related to the church, as the body forsakes Christ and going after a different gospel. Isaiah 54 verse 1 again, and that didn't post. Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing, thou that didst not travail with child, for more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife. So who are the desolate? Who are the ones that are desolate? Well, I mentioned just now the believers, right, coming into the Great Tribulation. They are said to be barren, they're not bringing forth. They are said to be desolate, widows. But more are the children of the desolate. In other words, when God brings back their captivity, now they come out of Babylon. Now they can bring forth. Than the children of the married wife. And again, the married wife there, I believe, would have to be a reference to Babylon. Galatians 5 verse 25. Galatians 4. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which is now and is in bondage with her children. And that's a verse I think we looked at the very beginning of the series when we talked about unequally yoked. Revelation 18 verse 7. How much she hath glorified herself, lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her, for she saith in her heart. And that's what I said just now. Now the church, because they rejoice over the killing of the two witnesses, they claim that they are no widow, right? Of course, because they happen to be married, but they're married to the wrong body. And she, she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. But we know sorrow comes. Sorrow does come on the church. When does sorrow come on Babylon? Coming into the Great Tribulation, there is sorrow on the whole church. Yeah. Well, yeah. Beginning of sorrows is at the start of the tribulation. That's the judgment that begins at the house of God. The believers, now they happen to be barren, desolate. They sorrow, they lament. But then when God brings judgment on Babylon, now the believers have joy. And who has sorrow? The church, right? Babylon. But she, in the meantime, at the time when she is rejoicing, she says, I am no widow and shall see no sorrow. Take a look at Luke 17, verse 27. They did eat, they drank, they married wives. They were given in marriage. You see that? And I offered last time that this is language of the church falling away, departing out from Christ in tribulation. God there, I believe he is looking at the mixed marriages, because it's the same thing that happened in the days of Noah prior to God destroying the world with a flood. So in tribulation, they are marrying and giving in marriage. And here's an interesting verse. Luke chapter 14, verse 20. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. And he was responding to the invitation to the supper, right? The supper of God, the marriage of the Lamb. And many began to make excuses. Isn't that interesting that God would use the language here? I have married a wife. So because now they are married to someone else other than Christ, they cannot come to Christ. They are not going to be redeemed. Mark chapter 10, verse 12. And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another. You see how this, Lord willing, would begin to tie in? And we talked about this before, right? Except for fornication. So the church puts away Christ, puts away the elect, and she is married to another, going after a different gospel, a different God. She committeth adultery. She is going to marry someone else, even though there is no fault, right? There's no fornication in Christ. But now because she puts away her husband, she marries someone else, now she commits adultery. Malachi chapter 2, verse 11. Judah hath dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord, which he loved, and hath married the daughter of a strange God. So there it is again. Matthew 19, verse 9. Trying to bring back some of the verses that we've talked about before, and seeing how, Lord willing, they would actually tie in to all the other language that we've been examining, right, concerning marriage. Matthew 19, verse 9. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. Now we see in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 20. Surely as a wife treacherously departeth from her husband. And the word treacherously there is speaking of deceit or marital unfaithfulness. So as a wife deceitfully or unfaithfully departeth from her husband, so have ye dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel. Isn't that interesting? And then finally, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. But if the unbelieving depart, see that again? If the unbelieving depart, if the church desires to turn away from Christ, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage. And we saw last time, or not last time, but the very first study, that the bondage there has to do with Hagar, right? Jerusalem that is now, who is in bondage with her children. Okay. Interesting verses, very complex, as I said before, the language of marriage in the Bible. But Lord willing, if we try to focus on the spiritual, try to pick up the gospel, I do believe there is harmony. So let me go ahead and post the conclusion, and then we can open for a short time of discussion. Okay, God, it seems, he contrasts between the wicked separating from Christ and marrying another. That's the married wife, right? She is married to someone else other than God at the time of the falling away. For this, they are said to bear less children, so they come under the wrath of God, right, in judgment, than she that is unmarried, and that would be the elect. They're unmarried in the sense that now they are no longer a part of the body. They've been cast out. Judgment begins at the house of God. Then the command to them, right? God speaks of them that they should remain unmarried or be reconciled to Christ, to husband. And this happens to, this is what allows them to bear more children. So in other words, when God visits them, they were first barren, desolate. God visits them. Now they bear more children, meaning they come out of Babylon. Salvation. Than those who engage in fornication, right? Mixed marriages, as we talked about last time. Okay, any questions, comments, correction to offer? Corroboration even, supporting verses. We can talk a little bit. Are we still on? Mic check. Okay, great. All right, let me turn off the recorder, and then we'll talk a little bit about the study, or maybe change topic.